Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the UC ANR Fire Network's Fire Safe Solutions for Design, Building, and Upkeep webinar. My name is Katie Lowe, and I am the statewide coordinator for the Fire Network, and I'm going to be one of the facilitators for the webinar this evening. And this webinar is really for those of you who are interested, whether you're a resident or a community member, and you want to learn more about simple and low-cost actions that you can do to protect your home and your property. To kick off our webinar tonight, we wanted to just first highlight some facts about, who's on this call, who's interested in this type of webinar. Well, 74% of you are homeowners, and 37% of you are members of your local Firewise community, which is awesome. We also have about 79% of California's counties represented by our participants tonight, which is super cool. When we asked you all in the registration survey about the actions you've taken to implement home hardening and defensible space strategies in your home or property, 53% of you said you already removed vegetation or combustible material 0 to 5 feet from your structures. 44% of you said you treated or rearranged vegetation and combustible materials 5 to 30 feet from your structure. And 26% of you said that you've already retrofitted your structures with ignition or ember-resistant materials. And then finally, when we asked you about some of the barriers to implementing these wildfire preparedness actions, 78% of you cited cost as being the top barrier, with 35% citing the lack of information and resources, and then 33% said existing building and design constraints were really your most pressing barrier for implementing these types of projects. So it's great to see so many of you have already implemented fire preparedness actions on your home and your property. And hopefully tonight, the information shared with you all will provide you with more information and resources that you can use to further your preparedness actions. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand it over to our presenter, Yana Valachovic.
All right. Good evening, everyone. While I get myself oriented here, I just want to applaud you all for showing up. That's always the first step in our journey as we try and navigate through some complex topics. And I am looking forward to learning from you as much as I may be interested in sharing some things that I've been observing, recording, experiencing, and so in the chat, I welcome, some robust conversation. Love to know if you've got any key tips, things that you're particularly excited about, shall we say hot on this year. And, I can tell from the audience who's here, there's a lot of folks that have been in this space for a while and have been engaging. So I think that's really exciting. I will give a shout out to my home county of Humboldt. I saw there's a number of registrants that are coming from Humboldt. Also saw a lot from Nevada County. So good on Nevada County. So my name is Yana, as I said, and I work in the North Coast, not exclusively. Forestry has been a lot of my game, but now I really am most oriented in the community resiliency and built environment space. And I also work in a lot of science communication and trying to translate science to make it more understandable for the rest of us through my work with the California Fire Science Consortium, which is a great collection of really awesome professionals that are passionate about all these great things. So tonight, we're going to talk about preparedness for the fire season. I want to talk some about the general factors that contribute to home loss. Here's a recent example from, I'm trying to remember, this I think is Altadena in Southern California. I'm going to talk about and show images, I just want to make this clear, from places that have recently or have in the last decade experienced wildfire. So I want to acknowledge that some of this can be hard to watch. And so if you're having recently gone through this, please know that I approach this with a heart and know that real people and real lives are involved here. But my work is really about trying to figure out key lessons and if there are things that we can gather from the experiences in other regions that we can bring to our home communities and try and get in front of some of these issues. I hope to instill some conversation around priorities for action this year. Love to hear your ideas. I want to hint at some of the things that you might be thinking about if you're building new or rebuilding, talk a little bit about maintenance, and then also leave with a few tips around examples and how we might take action in certain places. So hope that's what you've signed up for. I again just want to acknowledge all of your efforts to be here because we have a lot of competing demands. Here we are in May and we're firmly into spring. So, just a reflexive question. How are you preparing for wildfire season this year? And, the fire season certainly, it's hard to tell where it starts and stops. And depending where you are, sometimes it feels like it's year round. But what's on your top list? How have you and your family been thinking about these issues? And, are you feeling good going in, or you feel like there's some more work to be done? Has everyone signed up for the alerts? Do you know how they work? You know that you can sign up for alerts for multiple properties. So if you've got family members you're worried about, concerned about, you can also sign up for their locations, which I find a lot of peace of mind. I have had an elderly family member that I was trying to keep track of. So I think that's great that we have that capacity. So I want to bring forward a bunch of videos tonight, really just to try and illustrate how fire works and what's happening in a variety of settings. So this one is from the Ranch Fire, which was part of the Mendocino complex in 2018. And there's no sound with this. So this is really just illustrating how a grass fire moves into a semi-rural environment. There's some, I think, ag operations. There are some trees that we're going to look at. So here it starts as a grassland fire. You can see the spot fires start to emerge. I didn't take this video, so I can only tell you what I'm seeing from this video. You can see that there are a number of spot fires. There's one right in front of whomever is taking this picture. And then we're going to start to move into areas closer to the structures. You can see that fire personnel are on their way. And as we move into the structured environments, I think these are walnut trees. And what I want you to look for are the embers and how the embers start to move through the air column. The wind is picking up and the wind is starting to, oh, there's a deer getting out of the way. Very nice. Move and, dislodge leaves from the tree. So look at the embers starting to blow around on the ground. This is just meant to provide some illustration that we have a lot of stuff that can be fuel. And then, trees are able to produce embers, even if they don't fully engage. Looks like the structure's going up behind us. So it's a pretty dynamic environment. And I use this because I think it helps us get into the mindset of what might happen in our particular living situation. Okay. So part of where my research program is really trying to understand these patterns. I went to Los Angeles after the Eaton and Palisades fire twice this year. And one of the questions I was really after was, you can see in this very suburban looking community that there are, where the red arrows are, two structures that have been really consumed by fire. They're stucco in exterior cladding. They do happen to have a lot of steel 2x4s. And so that enables the building to not collapse, which is why it's a little harder to see. But the question I'm after is like, why those and not the neighboring one? Like, what happened there? What's the story? And what was the secret sauce, if there's any, to the one on the right and the left? And, and what happened to the one in the middle? You can see that this is in an area with a lot of native vegetation. In this case, it's some chaparral here. And there's, streets, and it looks like in some ways anywhere USA. So that's part of what I'm after, and trying to bring stories forward and bring data forward so that we can help make better decisions or inform our decision making as we prepare for each season's fire season. So just as context, right? We've had a lot of wildfire in California, especially in the last decade. 14 million acres, that translates to about 1 out of every 7 acres has experienced fire in some form in the last decade. Some of that's been beneficial fire, but a lot of that's been pretty impactful to our vast ecosystems. But it's also taken a lot of lives and a whole lot of structures. Almost 60,000 structures have been destroyed in this last decade. And embers are a really big culprit in that building loss equation. So if you haven't heard about embers, I'll talk about them more in a second. But an image of here on the beach in the Pacific, the fire burned directly to the beach. And there's again that pattern replicated I just showed you from another community. Now here it is right in Pacific Palisades. So just to start and make sure that we're all in the same equation, I need to bring a little bit of vocabulary forward, and that is to be thinking about pathways for wildfire. And I think about them in three different ways. First one on the left is really about fire coming from somewhere else, burning through vegetation, could be forest, could be grass, could be shrubs, could be woodlands. And as that fire connects through or travels through that vegetation, at some point it has a pathway to direct connection to the subject matter. In this case, it's a residential house, and you've got direct flame contact on the house. And depending on the condition of the house, that may or may not be a problem. So that's one pathway. The other one is embers, and embers are long distance transport. Can be as much as a mile or so of burning pieces of material, often called firebrands. Those can be pieces of burning vegetation. They also could be components of other buildings, and those get moved through the air column, and they can land on, as shown in the gutters here, adjacent, as shown around these bushes around this property, or in, going through the vents or open windows or a cat or doggy door or something like that. So embers are a little harder to think about and think about how we might mitigate those pathways because they have such a long distance component to it. The third term that I'd like to bring here is radiant heat. And radiant heat, as illustrated in this image, is the heat transfer from something. In this case, it's illustrated as an ancillary building or a shed of some kind. Could also be vegetation. That heat transfer, you don't have direct contact, but you have transfer that causes enough heat damage for some failure point on the structure. Here it's illustrated with windows. So these are the three primary pathways for fire to approach our structures, and there are a variety of different mitigation approaches for anticipating these pathways, and all are important. Most of our work for the last several decades has been around fuel management, defensible space, and that fits perfectly in that direct flame contact approach and fits perfectly, especially in times of moderate weather conditions where we can stage personnel to be able to directly attack that fire and protect the structure. So defensible space is really important for those kind of average fire conditions. Once we get wind and we get into red flag warning days and something more intense, embers then become this culprit, and they can overwhelm our fuel breaks and some of the more historic kind of fuel modifications through defensible space. And so we have to harden the structure as a result of that. We have to cut the pathways off for embers to enter the structure. And we also have to figure out what we can do with all the fuel and combustible material that's adjacent to our structures. And then this issue of radiant heat really comes into play when we get fire into communities where we've got building to building exposure to each other, and we've just got a lot of heat load to manage. So anticipating all three exposures is important. In the radiant heat scenario, then home hardening abilities to make more resistive qualities on the structure are important. So in this case, we might be thinking about tempered glass windows as opposed to annealed glass, and I can describe those in a bit more. All right, so here we are. We've got three vocabulary terms, and I'll stop from there going on. This is an image from the Los Angeles Times. It's not from the 2025 fires, but it's showing embers moving through and landing on receptive fuels. And I want you to think about which way the wind is blowing. Can you tell me if there are obvious signs around the direction of the wind? And Katie and Tori, I don't know, you've probably been tortured by this photo from me, but to me, it's really obvious. And it takes a little moment to figure that out. And why it's really obvious is what's going on the right-hand side. So you see this very yellow to white pattern right at the base of the wall. And you might think, well, there must be something super combustible there. That's why it's so hot. In fact, it's moving from the left to the right, because what is happening is that the embers are being moved. They slam into this wall on the right-hand side near the firefighter, and they drop to the base, and they're congregating or accumulating right at the base of that wall. And yes, there is combustible material there, so they have something to ignite, but there's more directional force going that way, and that's why we see more ignition on that side. So wind is moving from left to right, but there's also a lot of interesting kind of fluid dynamics where you can see the swirling pattern on the left-hand side. I hope that my cursor is coming through. You get a kind of a horizontal movement. On the right-hand side, you get more of a vertical movement. So anticipating a whole lot of ember exposure in a whole lot of different directions, and it could come from any direction, forcing on your structure. So this is the kind of scenario, the sort of battleground that I would like you to be thinking about in preparation for this year's fire season. If you got, a box of burning matches thrown at your structure, would it look like this, or would those matches just burn out and no issue would be had? So, last I'll leave you before we move off this slide is there something that could have been done differently here? That's a lot of firefighter resource on this one structure here. And this is what we're kind of faced with. And this kind of demand and aesthetic challenge around making sure that there's softness around the edges of our structures. Yet there's this inherent vulnerability because of the way we cultivate them and manicure them and use woody mulch in particular to try and reduce competition from weeds as well as keep the soil hydrated. So what I would say, if I could do this again, is I might flow the sidewalk out towards the edges and then put a focal point in the center with the greenery in the center of the image. So there's something to concentrate on, but we've hardened that edge so that when the embers land at the base of the wall, there's nothing there that's combustible. And I like Jim on the bottom. This photo makes me want to grab the garden hose and start putting it out. Totally, right? It's a lot to think about. This is probably grass here. These are some recently planted shrubs. This is brand new construction. All right. I'm going to bump around to a lot of different fires, a lot of different images. Here's some aerial images from the community of Paradise up in Butte County. And these are taken shortly after the fire. The burned homes are those with a little white ashy pictures. Now tell me on the left-hand image, where are the green trees? Are the trees near the buildings? Are they far away? Are they near the roads? Like, is there a pattern that you can see here? I think there's some interesting ways to look at this image, and you can see that the buildings are pretty close to each other. I did an analysis with some colleagues, referenced on the right-hand side. Average lot size in Paradise is over an acre. However, a lot of lots are long and skinny. And so the buildings ended up clumped up next to each other just by the way that the properties were developed there. But what you can see is that the homes are actually super combustible and that we didn't have a crown fire. We didn't have fire burning through the tops of the trees. We actually had these embers creating spot fires and ignitions on or in or within the buildings. And then once you got building ignition, then you had interaction between those buildings. And that's what caused the majority of damage to the trees in this image. So what we learned when we dug in trying to figure out a whole lot of things about Paradise was that 73% of the homes were within 18 meters. It's a little over 50 feet of a destroyed structure. And that became the strongest predictor of survival or loss. So the context, the condition where the buildings are certainly does make a difference. And I bring that forward because I think a lot of people think about like, oh, well, I have a house, but then I've got a couple sheds and I've got some things that, I store some stuff in there. But my focus should really be on my primary home. And while I agree with that, I want to just identify that the ancillary structures that may not have as much financial value to you could be the pathway. They could be the domino that leads fire from them towards your structure. So think about the landscape condition. Now that could be, I think, a somewhat defeatist message too, to say like, if my neighbors don't do this, then all is lost. And I want to just kind of reframe for a second and say that, yeah, we are all in this together. But I think we need to lead by example and be willing to take the responsibility and do the work ourselves before we judge or wait for someone else to do it. My mom was always someone who was very clear that fire was not her issue. It was somebody else's problem. And she was always ready to find fault with her neighbor. And she was never ready to do the work herself. You can imagine some mom-daughter interactions in there. But the point being, like, we need to see ourselves in this issue and we need to figure out how we can lead by example. All right, so I want to just express kind of what happens in wildfire, and especially one where we've got wind on it. So if we start on the right-hand side, what we often see is some kind of ignition point, and they vary by source. And that ignition point from the wildland, and you've got wind on it, starts moving the fire towards our built communities. And that continuity of vegetation, wildland vegetation to near to home vegetation is one of the risks we have. And what we tend to see is that vegetation then often connects to things like fences and allows basically like a fuse or a wick for the fire to just run straight up the structure. We can also get, the movement of embers, which send a longer distance movement of debris that can, create problems, more interior to the community. And we can also have other pathways where vegetation or fences are bringing the fire in multiple directions, heading towards the structure. While it doesn't, burn against the wind as well, you can still see that wicking and that movement of fire coming from multiple directions. So what we're going to talk about today is like, how do we interrupt that pathway? What can we do in this particular situation to make a difference? And what I'm going to argue is that if we recognize all forms of fuel, not just vegetation, but also some of the built stuff, we can create breaks in that pathway. So if we, in this case, replace this gate section or this fence section with a non-combustible panel or a non-metal gate right here, even if fire moves here, it's going to run into a barrier and then doesn't connect. If we harden our structures and make it less easy for embers to get in and remove the combustibles near our houses, then we're much less likely to get interior to our community fires and reduce this house-to-house dynamic. Can't tell whether I've lost the audience or whether you're on the edge of your seats, but I'm hoping you're on the edge of your seats. So really, we've talked a lot about in vegetation management, this idea of ladder fuels and how to, prevent fire from climbing from the ground into the crowns of trees. The same concept applies in the home setting where vegetation defense to house is a very, very common pathway. Thanks for the little kudos, makes me feel good. It's always hard to do this without anyone to see and get a sense of what you're thinking about. So now I'm going to go through a series of photos from my recent trip to LA. Again, very residential neighborhood. Let's just take a look at this. Here we have a privacy fence that is creating some of the backyard of this property. Fire ran down that fence. The fence made a hard left-hand turn, and then the fence would have drawn directly to the structure. But in this case, what happened here is that someone was able to create an intervention and basically removed this gate and broke the pathway here. So in last case, last ditch resort, if you haven't implemented zone 0 and you still have an attached gate, at least tie that gate open upon evacuation so that you can create that barrier so that the fence doesn't bring the fire to the house. Now, I'm not saying you don't need a fence. I'm certainly encouraging you to, to create the fence that you might need, but really break that pathway. And if the fence is running parallel, meaning like right at me in this walkway zone, you might want to push the fence a little farther away from the structure so that if it does ignite, it doesn't have direct flame impingement on the structure. All right, here's another couple of examples. Again, these are Southern California, but in some ways they kind of could look like anywhere. On the left-hand side, you can see how vegetation was used as the fuel ladder, climbed up from these manicured hedges. and then onto this kind of decorative conifer. We had enough flame height off it that we had flame bend over, and the fascia was fully engaged. Now, buildings don't self-extinguish. When you see something that's frozen in time and space like this, it means that someone was there to create an intervention. And I did work and talk with the community to confirm that there was, in fact, firefighter response. That's why this building didn't go any further. On the right-hand side, this is in the Palisades area, really nice walkway, kind of patio spills out into this walkway, about 8-10 inches of area that's been grown with some iris, and I don't really even know what this shrub is, but we got embers and there was debris here and we had ignition. I've been all over this property. There were firefighters all around, and they were able to put that ignition out. You can even see they pulled some of the things out and put them into the yard. So this house, super lucky. They did lose the garage. They didn't lose the house. But, I guess the question I have is, how different would it be without this vegetation here? How different would it be on the left-hand side with a little bit more breathing room from the house to the vegetation? These are I think, the trade-off questions that we need to be thinking about as we work with our communities. We talk to our families around, what the risk is, what the benefit, what the reward is. Most of us make the conscious decision that it's okay to wear a seatbelt now and that it's worth getting in a car with a seatbelt because we're likely to reduce the potential for loss of life during a collision. Well, here I think is another one of those cases where a little bit of action here, I think, would make a significant difference in the outcomes of these buildings. So, all right, now I'm going to show you a couple videos. I can't remember which ones have audio on them, but these are from walking down this pathway between the two buildings. You can see that the trees got involved and the trees led to a lot of heat exposure onto these windows. Here's where the window pane is on its way out because the glazing has melted, and you can see the breakage up there. These look to be annealed glass. I don't see the tempered glass bead, and you can tell by the way that the window is cracking. And then over here, the gate. Engaged. All right, I think a picture or a video tells 1,000 words there. Home completely lost on the other side, huge amount of radiant heat exposure. And then someone props the gate open. See this shovel here. So there was intervention that helped that from progressing further, but you can see what the radiant heat damage did in that particular case. And what was happening was basically the vinyl glazing that's holding the double pane window was starting to deform, and that's what led to the window panes starting to slip. The heat was also so intense that we were getting cracking in the first pane. The windows didn't fail, so that's the good news overall. But it just shows when you get that radiant heat exposure, the windows in these cases, because it was mostly a stucco or stucco-like product for the cladding, was pretty resilient to the heat exposure. And so the windows become the next limiting factor. I'm going to flip it around a little bit so that we can get some wider view on what this looks like, we're at this interesting place where we've got some damaged and some lost structures. Mountain View behind us. And you can see the damage on the stucco siding. And there actually isn't a lot of fascia damage, to my surprise. What we've been seeing in this fire is that the stucco construction helps hold in the heat as the building burns, and then it later collapses, which is likely what is slowing some of the heat damage onto the adjacent building. But walking down this way, you can see that this gate was really critical in not wicking the fire to the building, where here is the remnants of the wooden fence that was separating the two properties. I love that image. So can you see the last of the member of the wood fence here? And then it's just that gate had been upgraded, and what a big difference it made as the fire did not transmit to the rest of that structure. Let's see. Okay. Sorry. One more here. I'm hoping you're liking these. It's Palisades. No, it's Eaton, sorry. This one does not have any audio to it. So you can see the context, the house has a lot of patio work here, and what you can't tell is that there's vegetation to the backyard connection, and everything's looking really awesome here. There's some embers and some ash caught there. The gate was metal, so that wasn't a problem. Lost something in that section. But then when you pop over the edge, look at that whole building. Completely consumed. And so this block wall, which is fairly common in Southern California, did a lot of heat deflection. You can see that the palm trees, they got singed all the way up. It fire whipped up the edge. And then look at here. This is where the fence was, or the garden gate was, and then the shut off. And so they were so close to having it all together. That's where the completely consumed line is of this trailing hedge that's pretty common along these block walls. So, just thinking about calibrating your eye around what could become fuel is the point that I'm trying to make. Some of you, I can tell, have seen me talk before. Here's some examples from Boulder, Colorado, and the Marshall Fire. A couple of years back, I went shortly after the Marshall Fire extinguished. This is into early January. It was a December 31st fire. There's snow on the ground. That snow was part of what put the fire out. And I'm after that same kind of question. Why did these homes get lost, and why did these homes survive? And in this case, pretty clear and simple answer that it was really about some level of intervention. And I'm bringing it forward because you can see this labyrinth of fences and how these properties are all both carving out their own space and then interconnected through these lines of fences. And what happened in this case is that there are grass-related embers, which don't have a lot of heat in them, but the grass embers slammed into the fence, drop to the bases of the walls, and then you get ignition of this very parched, dry grass. And then that gets, the grass begins to carry the fire, and then you get more ignition of leaves and other things that catch at the fence, and then eventually you catch the fence on fire, and then the fence brings the fire to the houses themselves. So just being aware of these fence connections are, what I'm trying to bring forward. Here's from a Texas video. It's a relatively long video, but look at the grassland of fence, and we're going to watch fence to building. We got the fence running down this parallel line here. Surface fire carrying in whatever the backyard vegetation is here. Within a few minutes, we've got fence has ignited the shed. We got fence running in this direction. And then we're getting shed to building. It takes a while for firefighter response, 10 minutes at least. But, here was a fire that ignited not too far away. And, look, we've got embers into the attic, and, the rest is history here. So thinking about those pathways, that connectivity, that's what I'm trying to bring home here. So I know you've got a lot of questions. I just want to hint at a few of the home hardening things that we talk a lot about, and we can go in a lot more depth, not in an hour, but I just want to say there's a lot of stuff at play, and there are pretty predictable weak places on buildings, especially in these roof to wall intersections where you've got the roof and the wall right in direct contact with each other, and you can get material accumulated right at that transition point, and you're asking the wall and the siding to perform as well as the roof, which is actually designed to be able to ward off some of that fire. So some work can be done here to harden and upgrade this transition point. Rain gutters, super great. They help the siding from not rotting, but debris collects in them, and you can get fires that go right underneath the roofing itself and get into the decking and into the attic. And then vents themselves, very porous, super useful to get hot, moist air out and bring cool, fresh air in, but they create two-way exchange and you can get embers on the inside. So, there's a lot of work happening in home hardening and incentives and new construction. And I just want to hint at a few of those. So since I said this is going to be key tips, I would like you to think about what condition is your roof in? What condition are your vents in? And have you implemented zone 0? I think it's a hard question. I think most of us have some room for improvement in the places we live. And for everybody, all those three are the highest priority actions that need to be taken at all times. And, I know that the roof is expensive. And if you've got a wearing roof, boy, it's hard to decide, like, is this the year? I had to refinance my home to be able to afford a new roof in my case. So I get that can be a big lift. But the vegetation and the fuels near the property, that's something that depending on what physical condition you're in, it might be something that you can do yourself, or even just doing some simple upgrades to the vents can make a difference. When we, talk about where people live, where the buildings are closer to each other, then there are some additional priorities relating to managing that radiant heat issue, which I showed you, like with the window examples. And that's where we start talking more about the condition of the windows, whether you need tempered glass windows, which are more resistive to heat between buildings, or on the windows that are between those buildings, or whether, it's a more complex situation. So I'm just suggesting that 2025 might be the year to upgrade your vents and implement zone 0. So, here's a couple examples of places where people have vegetation right next to their structures. These are, again, from Los Angeles, and you can see lots of engagement and lots of placement of vegetation and vents right next to each other. This palm tree is particularly prone for igniting in wildfire, if any of you have one of those. Kind of magic incendiary device there. Even succulents can have damage. Even, this jade, it drops a lot of debris. And so it's got receptive fuels at its base. Alrighty, how you doing on that front? So if you're not caught up to speed on this, the vent piece is really about restricting the vent size so that it still allows air movement, but doesn't allow large size embers to come through. So moving from 1/4-inch mesh screening to 1/8 inch metal mesh screening is what we're trying to promote. Need to be careful because you can overspray when you paint your house and clog up these vent screens. And that can create, other problems related to moisture management. So it's not a one and done action. You do need to think about how you maintain these vents once they get to the smaller mesh screen size. But it's possible to add an additional layer of screening to a vent like this. You can take out some mesh and some wire cutters and a staple gun, and you can add that additional layer on the inside or the outside, whatever is easier. So low cost tip number 2. First was implementing the fuel management right next to the house. The second one are these vents. For those of you that have more wherewithal or maybe are building, there are a whole new class of vents that resist both flames and embers. And there's a lot to learn there. And I just want to direct you to our fire website because we've got a lot more detail in that website to help you think through these vent choices. And, within the property itself, there are, I think, a number of things to point out too. We've talked briefly about the function of a roof and that the roof shoulders the majority of the responsibility for protecting the house. It's the largest horizontal surface on the structure. And, most of us, if we're going to get a new roof, we are going to get one that meets the Class A standards. For those of us that have older roofs, I had a redwood shake roof. I can admit it. I worked in the space with a redwood shake roof, so that was a little bit embarrassing, but as I said, it just took me a while to raise the money to get there. So starting with that roof, focusing on the first 5 feet around the structure, and then upgrading the vents are the parts that we're talking about. And we're talking about all the vents on the property or on the building, not just the gable end vents here. And then breaking the fence connection by adding a non-combustible panel or gate right here. And then really focusing in on decks and making sure that we've got nothing underneath them that's combustible and that we don't store a whole lot of extra stuff on the decks. And that when we do hit the need to evacuate, or we know it's a pretty crazy red flag warning day, move that stuff away from the deck and off the deck. So what about the opportunity to build fresh and build new or to rebuild? I just want to offer a couple of things to be thinking about. Simple roof lines are far better. When you start getting these complex roof to wall intersections like shown on these bottom two graphics, that makes things a little more complex. I know a lot of our aesthetics and our pre-planned buildings often have those complex roof lines, but if you live in a particularly fire-prone area, keeping a very simple roof line is a great idea. Making sure from the very beginning that you incorporate zone zero in the design, thinking about the walkways, the paths, and how to design that in a way that works for your aesthetic. I showed you that earlier image with a firefighter, and how simple it would have been to flow zone zero in there from the beginning. A little harder to retrofit. So what a terrific time when you get to start over or you get to build fresh to bring that in. If you're thinking about building siding, not building on the edge of a slope, even though the view is fantastic and it's so tempting, because you can fire moves uphill and you can get a lot of heat moving with that and preheating. It really makes a tremendous amount of vulnerability to these structures that are perched over the edge of the slope. So backing off the edge of the slope, creating a setback is a really highly important and recommended idea. And then I just want to, share, you've probably heard us talk about Chapter 7A in the past, which is really a focus on ignition resistant materials and assemblies. And that is now being transitioned to the IWUI code that is meeting California standards now. So just becoming really familiar with those standards, and whenever, even if it's not required, I just highly recommend that people think about the materials, the design, the assembly, and the maintenance so that we can build a more resilient future going forward. Got a couple slides about decks, and I want to wrap up real soon here because I know there's a lot of questions here. I just want to hint at some different ways to be planning to build a deck and really creating some additional flashing so that if you get ignition in the deck, it doesn't transmit directly to the structure. And you can see, here how it's illustrated. This is a guide from and some graphics from a Tahoe publication, really fine publication that are available now. And so I know I'm running out of time, and so I can't quite get to all of these things, but I know my colleague is on the line, Dr. Steve Quarles. I've borrowed these images from him, and he and others at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety have offered some ideas around, how to improve the situation with decks. And here we've got an example of using some metal flashing or metal bitumen tape so that if you get ignition, it doesn't spread down the deck joists. And so he was working with a neighbor and trying to retrofit this in as an example. And you can see replacing the last deck board with one that is non-combustible. So some interesting opportunities to reimagine decks. And if you have the opportunity to retrofit one, so the better. Lots to be thinking about in terms of maintenance, and our roofs collect a lot of debris. I think this must be under an oak woodland. You can see a lot of acorns. And here more of these complex roof lines and assembly, or complex roof lines. And here we've got redwood or cedar shingles, highly combustible, and so you've just got a lot of fine fuels right next to them. So this is a weak point overall, and one that's going to take some additional attention to make sure this place stays clean, and to try and manage that vegetation that often blows and collects there. All right. I am thinking that I'm going to tell you about deck enclosures, and then I want to make sure we get some questions. And so there's some new thinking around how to keep embers out from underneath decks. And here's some screening that is underneath a deck. especially one that's in this kind of low to moderate height where it's a little too hard. You can't walk underneath it. You're kind of in the crawling space. You can see that there's non-combustible rock underneath, and then there's this additional enclosure to keep the embers out. What's useful about using screening is that you still allow moisture to flow. So if you're going to seal up the edge of or the perimeter of the deck, do think about moisture and moisture management, because you need to have a lot of ventilation to let that moisture that comes through the deck out, and so you don't rot the substructure of the deck. Where we're going in California is towards a third defensible space zone known as Zone 0. I've referenced that earlier. It represents the first 5 feet. And what it's really about is a paradigm shift where we start working from the house outward and really being attentive to the idea that embers are likely to arrive at some point in time in that area right around our house. And so how do we anticipate that and make sure that they don't have anything to ignite? So that's what Zone 0 is about. And it's really, a new way of thinking and very critical in being able to anticipate when we have fire with wind, what we need to be prepared for. Because when we have fire with wind, most of our fire personnel, their first effort is going to be in terms of getting us out of the way. And so evacuation takes preference. And so there are, less resources directed at individual structure defense. So I'm going to wrap up here by just saying the built environment has fuels all over the place, and they can be these wooden pots, they can be trellises, they can be sheds, they can come in many forms, even our garbage and recycling receptacles, the boats, the things we store around our structures. So, take some time maybe this weekend and walk around and look at what might constitute fuel. Even the petroleum-based products are fuel. In LA, I saw lots and lots of just puddles of melted garbage cans and this like horrible green ooze. It took me a while to recognize that what we were looking at were the loss of those garbage cans. I imagine that the wind blew open the lid, and that's how embers got on the inside of them. And then we had ignition of whatever was stored in those garbage cans. So reimagining how we landscape, is a challenge for all of us. Here's a couple visuals on what a functional Zone 0 might look like, but I'm very excited to see and hear your stories and if any of you are implementing those approaches. So I want to conclude with, what do we do here? What should we be doing in situations like this? I bet you know somebody that lives in a way that looks like this. Maybe they have been injured this year, and so they just can't get out. Maybe they're aging and it's just too much. So where do you start, and how do you start protecting those that are most vulnerable? In this case, I probably start with making sure this person has signed up for the alerts and knows how to evacuate. And maybe during the fire season, they focus on getting themselves out of the area during some of those critical fire weather areas, even before the alerts go off. After that, boy, you could do a lot with a weed whip, couldn't you? And maybe we might think about these buried boards that are creating these steps, because you've got direct vegetation contact to those, and those can become the pathway up to the house. There's just a lot of things to assess here, and prioritization. Got to start with priorities here. What about here? Anyone know someone who has one of these kind of modified trailer environments? Certainly, they are pretty financially vulnerable. If I'm going to do a property visit to someone like this, I think the first thing I start with is with oh my gosh, you've got the best view in the world. I can see why you might live here. And, try and work from a place of empathy and learn more about what they've got going. Because wildfire interacting here and the loss of this structure would be not recoverable in my assumption of what their financial situation is. So this could be a great recipient for a community work day, if they're open to it, and just really trying to reach out and see what we can do to protect those within our communities. How about here? Santa Cruz Mountains, a lot of potential for zone zero, just a bit of storage stuff here, both the milled lumber as well as some firewood. Maybe there's a few things underneath the deck. There's some things to look around here, but for the most part, they're generally on the right pathway. And there's some maintenance issues, but I think someone that we could work with pretty easily. And I'll conclude with, what about this structure? What do we do here? Neat and tidy, right? They've taken care of that extra building materials, the firewood's tucked away, bike's got a place to hang out. I'm sure we've all got a situation that looks like this. Now, depending on the property, it might be possible to relocate the storage for this somewhere else, but maybe not. And so maybe the strategy should be about enclosing a structure like this so that it's not vulnerable to embers. Just taking some different thoughts around how you might work with situations like this. A lot of carports are in similar situations, so we need places for material to be tucked away and out of the weather. But if they're really porous, then there's some other issues. So I'm going to wrap up here by just saying that we're in a paradigm shift right now. I think there's a lot of reason for hope in that we can see where we can make direct action. And if we, approach it in this idea that we're not trying to fight fire, but we're really trying to learn to live with fire. We're trying to be more adapted to its presence, and that it's a natural part of California's ecosystems. Then I think we can get to a better place where we both build smarter and we make choices that will help our structures, our communities, our families be more resilient to its future exposure. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. And I know that there's a lot of questions here. I can see them. And Katie, I will say that I just noticed that Steve Quarles is in the audience. And so maybe we can pull him up as a panelist if he'd like to join us. And
Sure.
I'll let you guys tell us where we should go. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yana. I'm just gonna say we have so many questions from the audience, and Tori and I have been doing our best, but acknowledging that the webinar is supposed to be over in like 6 minutes. We're logging all the questions and saving them. So if your question doesn't get answered live, we will send out a typed Q&A document with the recording link at the end of the webinar. So in some way, shape, or form, your question will get addressed. Okay, I'm going to promote Steve to be a panelist. So,
and I'm going to
hopefully
just say that I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer if somebody's really got a burning question that they want tonight. And thanks for letting me put you on the spot there, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
That's what
No
happens
problem.
when you send me a text in the middle here.
So we have a list of questions, Yana and Steve, and Tori, if I could just read them off to you in order. So the first one is from Matt O, and he asks, why are the insurance companies out of sync with California fire issues? My insurance is being canceled, but our property passes the California fire inspection process with no recommendations. Is there anything being done to close this gap?
A terrific question. I don't work for the insurance industry, so let me make that clear. Not a decision maker in that space, but my perception is that we're in a really awkward adjustment phase right now. And there's a lot of effort to try and harmonize what we're talking about, both the work that Steve Quarles, my colleague, and I do, and then bring that in to the equation. I can't say to the context from which that particular property is, but sometimes you'll see cancellations be because a company is overinvested in a certain community, like they have too much of the market there. And so the cancellation feels a little indiscriminate because you're like, what? I don't get it. I think I'm doing all the right stuff. And they are going, I've got 40% of the insurance market here. Maybe we need to readjust it. So Steve, do you want to bring us any thoughts around, the non-renewal issue? And I guess I'll just say that the insurance commissioner is putting out a lot of ideas around this, and the Safer from wildfire program is one of those, and we're just starting to see the discounts come out that are giving some small credit towards certain mitigations. At the same time, insurance rates are rising, especially because reinsurers are putting so much expectation on California admitted carriers. So their insurance is raising at the same time as the discounts are showing up. So they don't often appear the same. I think just hang on. I think it's going to just take a while to kind of get all these concepts to work together.
I don't have anything to add. You did nice.
Cool. All right. The next question is from Tammy. What is Governor Newsom doing to reduce fuel loads in our forests and residential cities? Many residents are prevented from removing fuel loads from protected areas, and many of our state parks are in terrible shape with respect to defensible space.
Great question. We're all in this together. We're all trying to figure out how to manage these issues and get to the pace and scale around this. I can't speak for the governor's strategy. I think I'd encourage you to plug into the Wildfire Forest Resilience Task Force, where there's a bunch of focused effort really trying to supercharge this space and think in a holistic and coherent way, and to try and accelerate action. There are tons and tons of barriers in the way, from qualified workforces to permitting to markets to the list goes on and on. So I certainly feel for you, but I guess what I'll just say is anything you can do yourself is helpful, because what is near to the building is really going to be a consideration should you get wildfire in your community.
Cool. All right. The next question comes from Julia, and they ask, can you speak to balancing the need for shade versus fire safety? I'm wondering what the risks are for, one, a large shade tree, two, a metal arbor located 5 feet away from the house.
You want to take that one, Steve?
Sure. Well, so the shade tree, depending on the tree, the vulnerability really was debris drop and debris accumulation on the roof and the gutter. If the tree is well limbed up and there aren't any ladder fuels that can bring fire into the top of the tree, the tree isn't itself such a thing. It's what it does in terms of debris accumulation on your roof. So it's just a maintenance issue for you. If the tree falls within 5 feet of the house or overhangs, there's some evidence from post-fire studies that just increases the vulnerability of your home. So that's just the fact of the matter. So you have to address it by vigilant maintenance, changing potentially some components on your house to resist flames that might come. Yana, you can, and the metal arbor isn't the problem. It's really if you have a lot of vegetation growing on it, and then the condition of that.
I think I know it's probably hard. I flashed a lot of images, but I showed a lot of buildings with debris accumulation on them, and most of them come from trees and taller vegetation. So having vegetation is great. I mean, you get shade, you get a nice tree to hang out with, all those things, but there's a maintenance issue and there's a maintenance responsibility that I think comes with living in a fire frequent environment. So being aware of that and just being on it is kind of what the name of the game is now. And recognizing that even when you're on it, that when you get a wildfire with a lot of wind behind it, a lot more stuff is going to come down in that wind event. And so even if you've cleaned your gutters and you've kept your zone zero free of debris, you're going to get some more stuff. So you're trying to keep not store anything there, because you're going to get some more that just happens through that, wind distribution and rattling, of the canopies.
Thank you. The next question comes from Amy. They ask, curious to hear recommendations on window frames, e.g. fiberglass versus metal.
A lot of research has shown that the most vulnerable part of a window, if you look at the frame and the glass, the most vulnerable part of the window is the glass. So tempered glass is really a critical part of that. So between fiberglass and steel, or metal, metal is arguably better, but the glass is the most important thing. And the one exception is vinyl. So I think vinyl frames are the ones that are most vulnerable, and they're more likely to be damaged during from heat. Um, so between those two options, I think you can be indifferent. Just the glass is the most important thing. If you have some source like a tool shed or something really close to a window, then you would want to um, move the shed or make sure you have dual pane tempered glass each pane. That I think that's sort of it. The frame is more of an aesthetic and cost thing, except when it comes to vinyl, and then you sort of would want to not have that. The other kind of framing materials, take your pick.
Yeah, so the
Thank you.
strategy being different when you're got near to building potential radiant heat exposure.
Right.
Thank you. I do want to acknowledge we are past time, but so for those who have to hop off, thank you so much for joining our webinar. We do kindly ask that you fill out our post-webinar evaluation survey, which should pop up in your web browser after you exit the webinar. But if Yana and Steve are okay, I think we can stick around and maybe answer a few more questions. Okay, so the next question comes from Thomas, and they ask, will there be a grace period following when Zone 0 regulations are expected to be adopted on January 1st, 2026? I heard 1 year, and I've heard a 3-year grace period.
Yes. So Zone 0 is currently working its way through the regulatory development of the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. If it stays on its current track, it would be roughly adopted around January 1st. It would apply to new construction immediately. If the permit's already partway through, I think it really, I think it follows to the new permittees as opposed to ones that are in place. That's certainly a best practice to kind of come up to speed immediately if you can. And then for those of us that have buildings already that we're trying to keep track of and Zone 0 applies to us, there's a 3-year grace period to come into it, to recognize that it's going to take some people more time to get in front of it than others, and to make plans. For those of you that can get there sooner than later, I think early adopters are likely to be rewarded through the insurance industry and through other kind of avenues. And so I can understand being reluctant to adopt it, but at the same time, I think there's a good reason to accelerate movement on it, especially if you're thinking about selling your home, because it's required as part of the disclosure process now in the real estate transaction space. Both home hardening disclosures as well as defensible space disclosures are critical to that transaction.
Cool. All right, next question is from Kim. Can you talk about securing ridge vents?
So I'm not quite sure what that question means. Ridge vents are pretty well secured. And
Maybe hardening, they
right.
meant hardening.
So if you mean hardening, then most ridge vents are plastic, and so the problem or the vulnerability of those plastic ridge vents would be debris accumulation against them and embers igniting that debris, and then you have flaming exposure to the plastic part of the ridge vent. What was shown in some research that we did when I was with IBHS was that an external baffle was really good at minimizing ember entry, actually eliminated ember entry. So one way to think about it, since there isn't really a standard test method for these kind of vents right now, if you can find a vent that is resistant or is approved for use against wind-driven rain, then it'll also be good for fire or embers. So these wind-driven rain vents are really popular, common in the East, but here we are in the West, so not as easy. You can also find metal ridge vents, and so if you're in the process of getting a new one, you can get a metal ridge vent, and that would get you to the same place.
Next question is from Bill. Vinyl fences melt in fire, but do they transmit fire to the home? Do you replace vinyl gates with metal?
So I think the answer is yes, to that. But to your point, vinyl fencing that burns is because other things around it are burning. The 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 C in vinyl is polyvinyl chloride, and the C is the chloride is a fire retardant. So once the like mulch or other vegetative fuels around the fence, or if you have a wood pile next to your vinyl fence, it'll burn as long as that those other things are burning. And when those things burn out, then the vinyl fence will go out. Um, so it's resistant to ignition by embers, and if you don't have anything around it that can burn, then it's not going to burn. But it is a combustible material. I just think it's safer, particularly for that section that meets your house, to replace it with something non-combustible.
Okay. On that, Steve, would you like on a chain link fence often get slats sometimes to create a privacy element, and sometimes those are vinyl. Do you have any concern about that usage?
It's the same thing. It would act the same as a vinyl fence, but they do have metal slats. So I'm not quite sure why you would not why you would except for the cost part. It's just safer all around just to stick with the non-combustible option there.
You. All right, next question is from Dan. Are wooden retaining walls equivalent to wooden fences in terms of connection to a structure?
Yes.
Yep. Especially when you have a pretty intense surface fire.
And most of the retaining wall members are treated with a preservative, and most preservatives allow for more smoldering combustion to happen, so it'll keep the fire moving, even though it may not be flaming. It'll be moving as a smoldering front. So yes.
And then Jim asks, is replacement of wood fencing with PVC in parentheses vinyl effective? Does a Class A flame spread vinyl make a difference?
So a PVC fence often has a Class A flame spread rating. We talked about the vinyl fence earlier, and I think there's no particular change here. It is the debris around it that will allow that PVC fence to burn. Once that goes out, the fence will go out. So I think the thing of if you have a vinyl fence anywhere and you don't want it to burn, then get rid of be vigilant about removing debris around it. If there's a radiant heat exposure, it will deform relatively easily.
Thank you.
Can we take Kevin Spock's question, and maybe I'll read it because I think it's a great one for Steve since we have you here on the spot. Do you mind?
No.
Okay. Retrofitting. Do you have any info to compare effectiveness of one replacing the bottom 2 feet of wood siding with some non-combustible siding, installing fiber cement over the bottom 2 feet, or installing metal flashing over the bottom of the existing wood siding? So if you're trying to create more vertical non-combustibility, how would you approach that?
So you need to, that's why I think that the thing about this zone zero, and when we're talking about zone zero, we really are implying a horizontal zone zero. We need to accompany that, or need to be complemented by a vertical, in essence, zone zero that doesn't need to be very tall. And you can get there by by removing the bottom course or two, applying fiber cement. Well, I don't think I would. I think the least favorite thing would be applying the fiber cement to the siding, just for the bottom two, because you're going to have a hard to retrofit gap.
Yeah.
And that will you'll end up with water problems, decay in the wood siding behind the fiber cement. So you remove the bottom pieces and replace with fiber cement. That's perfectly fine. You
To get the lap
install,
right.
yeah, in order to get the lap, yeah, you have to sort of get, well, you would see, I think that the advantage is that fiber cement patterns are often very similar to wood patterns. So you can probably match it pretty carefully, but pretty closely. If you use a metal flashing member, you just need to make sure that it terminates behind a lap siding or tucks in to if it's a panelized siding product, then it tucks in so that water doesn't get between the, the metal flashing and the wood siding that you're trying to protect. That's the key. So if it's easy to replace the bottom two, that's probably the best thing to do. Alternatively, using the metal flashing is perfectly fine. You just need to make sure that the upper part tucks in either behind the lap siding or tucks into a panelized siding so that you don't get water between the two things.
There's also one more question here about a deck that's 10 feet above the ground. And I think I opened the door of conversation, but didn't close it necessarily around what do you do with taller decks? Do you need to enclose with screening? The answer is no. What you really need to do is just manage the combustibles underneath those taller decks. So you're not going to prevent embers from getting underneath there, but there should be a lot less stuff that's combustible under there. It's a lot easier to maintain. When you have these decks that are, like 4 feet and under, the kind where you're really crawling under there, it's hard to get there. That's where the enclosing might be an idea to take up. I live in a place where, boy, it rains all the time and it's pretty easy for birds to drop seeds through my deck, and I get stuff that starts growing under my deck. So I need access to be able to keep the blackberries from getting on, or the ivy or other things that has a way of creeping in. So I think maintenance is always a part of the equation, and trying to figure out a system where you can really functionally handle the maintenance is the importance.
And do not enclose with a siding product, because you're not going to be able to dry out the inside, that under part of your deck. So if you're going to enclose with screening. It moves air in and out and keeps debris from going in, and it keeps embers from going in, or minimizes them. So
yeah, and Steve, you'll see a lot of people are using like a corrugated metal to go around the base of their deck. Then they're just gonna have to put in a lot of venting, right?
yeah. But how much venting? I can guarantee you your deck doesn't get rained on, and you're gonna have a lot of water entering into that underdeck area. And it's just sort of an unknown how much venting you have to do to keep that area dry.
Right, because the calculations are built for a roofed situation, not for
or a crawl space that only has soil from the bottom,
right.
not from the sides and the top.
Yeah. So screening makes more sense.
Yeah.
From a deck durability to moisture issue.
Right.
We have a couple questions about sprays, both on the house and on landscaping. So someone asked Kay if they spray their landscape with Frost Check before fire season, it can suppress fire. Is it effective? People also asked, can they spray the siding of their house with any gels or coatings?
So the Frost Check, it's a fire retardant. It's a long-term fire retardant. It'll hang around. It's also a fertilizer, so your vegetation is going to grow. But it works. I think the problem is it typically is just applied to the top, the surface part of the plant, and you have a lot of dead stuff inside of it. It's not going to do anything for you. So I would think that maintenance of the plant is much more important than this particular strategy. Gels, I would say don't you as a homeowner should not rely on them. They're effective for only a few hours. If you wait to the last minute to apply them and then evacuate, you're going to maybe be in trouble from an evacuation perspective. And if you apply them long before, as you're leaving, and you're leaving really early, then the gel is ineffective by the time the fire might reach you. So as a homeowner, don't rely on it. As a first responder, that's a different story. They're hanging around, and they can come back and check. So it's a strategy that might be useful for a first responder, but it is not useful for a homeowner. And maybe some confusion between gel and foam. Foam is a product that's used when you have a fire that's burning and you're using it to put it out. a gel is intended, it's like a diaper. It's a polymer with a lot of water molecules hanging onto it. And so you have just a lot of water that fire has to burn through by evaporating all of the water molecules. It does that from the minute you put it on. And so if you're, it becomes ineffective after a while. And for homeowners, it's just not a good strategy.
Thank you. We have a question about boxing in eaves and soffits. It is a big expense, so how important is it in terms of home hardening priorities?
So there's two reasons why enclosing your under eave area is to um, there's two things. One is that the vents in open eave construction are more vulnerable to ember entry than vents in soffited eave or enclosed eave. And the other one is that if flames are going to get there, then open eve is far more vulnerable to ignition and flame spread. So if fire can't get up into that area because you have non-combustible siding and a good zone zero, then enclosing isn't so necessary. You still want to make sure you have fine mesh screening in any vents that might be in the open eve area, I would say is a thing. So
Cool, thank you. And then someone asked, is it worth it to enclose roof overhangs with 1/8 inch mesh wall to fascia?
So that's the same question as before. It's enclosing the undereave area, and it's really the likelihood of flames getting up there, and then we have that vent thing. So if you have vents in open eave, make sure they're fine mesh or flame and ember resistant. If you have if there's a shot at having flames impinged, then enclose. I think it's pretty straightforward.
Thank you. We have a question about zone zero. What is a response to a question about zone zero requirements like, I have and love plant ABC and I don't want to remove it from zone zero? Is there any like scientific literature out there that specifically shows that plant ABC is fire prone enough to be in zone zero or?
Well, it's a terrific question, and I'm sure for those of you that are representing fire safe councils and work with community members, I mean, gosh, we all get attached to certain plants. I totally understand that. You know, I think the first question is that plant movable? Like some plants are transplanted better than others, and that might be a strategy to think about. Maybe it's the last plant that's talked about. I mean, maybe that's the favorite one, and so you work off the other ones first. Clearly, to me, the combustible mulch is the first thing to go. And then dry grass, weeds, those kinds of things are next on the list. Ladder fuels, that's all super important. And I think you saw from some of those pictures that, you know, we see succulents burning, we see lots of things that deposit debris, and you get ignition in debris deposit. I think the other challenge is that we go through droughts and we have times of water curtailment and needing to be responsive to those water demands is critical in kind of being a good citizen of California, because we don't always have the water we need and during the times we need it. So I guess see if it's possible to move that plant to another place where it'll be happy, and make sure that plant is in a place where they can see it from their kitchen window or from their kitchen sink, where they spend a lot of time looking out the window, and see if that works.
But the other thing, another way to think about this is that you have basically two things you can do. You can reduce the threat, so to speak, or you can harden the thing that the threat might threaten. So if you choose not to move something, and no one's and the regulatory authorities don't make you move something, and the siding, let's say, is vulnerable, then replace the siding. That's another strategy, is to harden against the thing that might threaten or burn. So
Cool. I think we have time for just two more questions. So, we have a couple of questions about heat pumps. What do you recommend to protect heat pumps?
I don't know. I mean,
Mm.
I
Mhm.
screening, but
I mean, I haven't seen that many heat pumps
right.
get damaged. I think it
Yeah.
matters more what they're placed on. And so like if you're doing the work yourself and I don't even know what the code says, but I imagine it's something that's on cement or something non-combustible. I wouldn't put it on a pallet. I think that's a consideration, and I wouldn't store a lot of stuff right near that heat pump in general. So if you keep the flammable items away from the heat pump, I haven't really seen much damage.
Right. I
I
mean,
have,
it might hang off a wall to be
yeah,
up.
I have seen some issues with the um, insulation around pipes, and some of the heat pumps have those insulated cores, and so I've seen a few ignition points on those. Steve, have you seen that?
That's for freezing. Something, but
Right, but I've also seen a post fire where they got burned.
uh,
Fire,
so I mean, foam is combustible,
yeah,
so it will do something if the heat load is high enough.
yeah.
Cool. And I think a perfect last question to end this webinar on are what are some potential incentives to promote someone like a friend, a neighbor, another community member to take action?
Education and a glass of wine. I don't know.
I'd say lead by example, and
Yeah,
and
that's true.
maybe and
That's a good
maybe
one.
be kind of excited about it. Like, I just did something really hard
This is
today,
what
and
I
I'm
did.
feeling better about it. Like I
Yeah.
have, I mean, last week I have to say I cut down a tree in my front yard, and I was with mixed emotion, and then my kid was mad at me for a day, and then we're over it. It's done, it's gone, we're over it, and it's brighter in my kitchen, and you know.
Good response.
And my answer was, we'll plant another Japanese maple somewhere else where it can grow to its right size and not be underneath my eaves.
All
Awesome.
right.
Well, thank you so much, Yana and Steve, for this awesome webinar and for staying late for doing the Q&A. And thank you all so much to everybody who hung on this long. It's a big testament to your interest in wildfire preparedness. Like I said, we'll send out the link to the recording as well as the Q&A document that we'll put together and all the wonderful resources shared sometime this week. So thank you so much.